Welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. Did you know that 98% of Australia's trade passes through the maritime domain? 91% of its fuel is imported, and Australia's exclusive economic zone is larger than its mainland. It's easy to see that to Australia, maritime matters. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we break down what the week's events mean for Australia's maritime security and the wider Indo-Pacific. Hello, welcome to the Maritime Matters podcast. I'm Richard Dunley, and I'm joined by my co-host Jennifer Parker. We're recording today, which is Thursday the 22nd of May, and as always, if nothing massive happens in the next day or so before we get this out, that's why we're not covering it. Maritime Matters is the podcast where we try and unpack key developments that's been happening in maritime security in the maritime domain more broadly in the Indo-Pacific and beyond. So we're going to dive in. We've not recorded for a little bit longer than we'd like to, so there's quite a lot of things to talk about. But before we get going, Jen, what have you been up to over the past week or so?
I had a piece out actually in UK media talking about how Australia and the United Kingdom can collaborate on defence aspects of technical interoperability that are beyond AUKUS. So I did a podcast with Chris Ullman called the Powerline podcast talking about maritime strategy. But nothing as exciting as you've been publishing, Richard. What have you been writing about?
So I've mentioned it briefly in the end of the last podcast, but it was then coming out and has now since come out. I had a piece out in the Lowy, the Interpreter, on submarine cables, talking about trying to think about how actually we view this a lot as a weakness, but actually the ability to control the global commons gives you the ability to control this infrastructure of information. And actually that's potentially a really important strategic advantage. And so we often look at these things as weaknesses, but not necessarily sort of flip the narrative and talk about why it is that these things are potentially strengths to those who can control the seas. I've also been doing some stuff. I've got a piece out with ASPI that came out today talking about deterrence and trying to prod the bear a little bit about why it is that we love to talk about deterrence in Australian strategic documents, but we don't ever like to talk about who we're ever deterring from doing what, or whether or not deterrence actually is a hugely useful concept to somewhere like Australia. And I've actually also got some academic stuff out talking about underwater weapons and arms control, and trying to look at basically what were the motives behind efforts to restrict the use of underwater weapons and how that feeds through into modern arms control. So yeah, a few bits out, but as much as anything else, this is luck as to what ends up coming out at any one time. The joys of writing things.
I'm really looking forward to reading the last one about arms control. I gave a lecture on Friday at the University of Wollongong talking about the law of naval warfare, and I often find in a lot of discussions about capability, there was a discussion on Twitter yesterday where people were talking about just getting containerized missiles and putting them on targets of opportunity, and I just pointed out that according to the law of naval warfare, i.e. there is law that governs the execution of naval warfare, that would be a breach because merchant vessels and auxiliary vessels don't have what's called belligerent rights, which means the right to actually engage in conflict during a naval conflict. I'm glad that somebody's talking about this stuff because people seem to forget that there's this whole regime called the law of naval warfare that has kind of rules and obligations. But anyway, what's been happening in the region, Richard?
So we've been talking for some time on this podcast about the deployment of Royal Australian Navy vessels as part of their regional presence deployments. And of course, we've been talking about HMAS Sydney and how she's been doing all sorts of exciting things, including exercises in Southeast Asia and multilateral maritime cooperative activities. And just putting that one in there just to annoy you, Jen, Sydney is now supporting, it's taking part in Operation ARGOS, which is the Australian operation which supports UN Security Council sanctions against North Korea. This is a kind of long-running Australian commitment, and we talked a little while ago about the deployment of an Australian P-8 aircraft as part of this, and now Sydney is involved in this. It's as I say, important relatively regular deployment of Australian warships and aircraft. It's also important because, obviously, of where it's taking place and the deployment of Australian assets up into Northeast Asia. This is something that clearly is something that the Australian government sees as a value and as part of the kind of broader rules-based order. But it also has this sense of, it has at times created quite a lot of tension, particularly with China, and we've seen a number of incidents coming out of this, of there being questions posed by China as to what it is that Australia is doing in this neck of the woods that they see very much as their kind of area. So it's just interesting. It's worth noting that Australia is very much continuing this and continuing to support Operation ARGOS and the wider sanctions on North Korea.
And I do wonder, I mean, I don't have the statistics, there's no analysis here, this is just opinion, which makes me an academic, right? But
absolutely, right?
Absolutely. But it does actually seem like Australia has really emphasised Operation Argos over the last couple of years. So Australia started conducting Operation Argos, I think, in about 2018. Sydney is the 13th ship to undertake Operation Argos. Obviously, we use maritime patrol aircraft to do it as well. And it's the monitoring of sanctions, as you mentioned. But we do hear a lot more about it than we used to. And I think there has been more of an emphasis on it, which I think is interesting in terms of the why. Because certainly there hasn't been a lot of success at the UN Security Council in terms of the sanctions on North Korea. The Oversight Committee was not renewed. There's a bunch of challenges. So I just think this is an interesting focus for Australia, especially given a good focus, thoroughly support it, but I think especially given the lack of maritime assets that Australia really has at the moment, which we will delve into with... Are you ready for Indo-Pacific Endeavour? I'm going to pull out my soapbox. So we talked about Sydney's deployment. The other thing that was kind of announced this week, or last couple of weeks, from Australia's Department of Defence was the new look Indo-Pacific Endeavour. So what is Indo-Pacific Endeavour? Well, what I thought Indo-Pacific Endeavour was, and I was at sea in 2017 and 2018 in the first two Indo-Pacific Endeavours, was a naval task group deployment, which became more maritime as it went on with support from the other services to the region, the Indo-Pacific region, sometimes in northeastern Indian Ocean, sometimes in South China Sea, Southeast Asia, sometimes in the Pacific, coordinated with a RIMPAC deployment. And it was about international engagements, yes, but it was also about the other aspects of naval diplomacy, which are really important in terms of presence operations. And so when we go to the current Indo-Pacific Endeavour, the press release talks about it's going to enter its new phase where the headquarters has moved from being an embarked model, i.e. embarked in a task force in the region for 2 to 3 months, to a different, longer execution window. But the point is there's no ships. They're not on ships. So there's a big difference from a significant task group deployment that also conducted international engagement to what is now appears to be just a deployable international engagement team. Now, again, I think this is really useful. Don't get me wrong. I think if I was to write a report card on the ADF's strengths in the last couple of years, I think international engagement has been a real tick. I think that's something that they've certainly nailed. However, when we talk about what is Indo-Pacific Endeavour, right? Indo-Pacific Endeavour began in 2017, as I mentioned. And the original statement on Indo-Pacific Endeavour, Defence Minister Maurice Payne talked about it being a new activity with a chance to demonstrate capability. So demonstration of capability, naval presence, a key important element, foster cooperation and reinforce the rules-based order. The task group will demonstrate the ADF's ability to operate across the full spectrum of military operations, from high-end military capabilities such as anti-submarine warfare to humanitarian and disaster relief. So why do I highlight this? At the time, it was the largest naval deployment or naval task group in 2017 that Australia had deployed since the 1980s. And it was really about maritime presence and maritime diplomacy. And I think when we think about Australia's current strategy of strategy deterrence by denial, and I take your comments on deterrence, a key element of a strategy of deterrence is the demonstration of capability. And for a maritime nation like Australia, the demonstration of a maritime capability is critical to that. So this kind of launching of the new phase of IPE, which is a completely different, a deployable team that goes and does international engagement, which is important. But it is a significant shift from the large naval task group plan, which was Indo-Pacific Endeavour. And in some ways, I think it actually undermines this whole idea in terms of our deterrence strategy. Because you just take one look at that and you say, are they not capable of deploying that task group anymore? Now, I'm not saying that that's the case, but I just worry about the messaging with this Indo-Pacific Endeavour. What are your comments on it?
I very much take your point, and I think that there are real challenges, and I think in some ways they would have been much better off to say that Indo-Pacific Endeavour is not being done anymore.
Yes,
and do
cease it.
Different. I do, and I think, reading between the lines, I think you're probably right in your suggestion that actually this is a capability challenge, right? We know that the problems that the RAN is facing in terms of putting ships to sea. I do wonder if you then take a bigger picture, if you actually say, okay, well, the RAN is trying to do more of other things. So things like, I think you're seeing, again, I'd have to look at the numbers specifically, but my sense very much is that you're seeing greater presence, particularly in the South China Sea, as part of engagement with the Americans, the Philippines, the Japanese, and others. And that perhaps you're seeing a shift in the presence in the region away from what might be seen as more of a softer end maritime diplomacy and presence type operation as part of IPE. And they're saying, okay, well, we don't have the resources to do everything, so we're now going to prioritize something that is slightly more hard-nosed in terms of putting assets into an area where you're doing quite clear signaling operations against, in this case, primarily China. So I wonder whether that's kind of the balance that's going on in the background. But even that obviously is highlighting the fact that in reality you probably want to be doing both. And the fact that you can't do both speaks to exactly the kind of problems that you're making. So that would be my attempt to try and nuance it a little bit, but yeah.
No, look, I see your point, right? But so there's a great soundings paper from the Sea Power Centre that was written in 2020, and I better give a shout out to the authors. So by Professor Adam Lockyer, Justin Burke, Isheng Lim, and Fred Smith, right? And the paper looked at the foundations of Indo-Pacific Endeavour. In this paper, it talks about one of the things that was kind of acknowledged is that the Navy had gotten into the habit of deploying single ships. And it was saying in this paper that what they acknowledged is that the diplomatic impact of that was diminishing because of this. So Indo-Pacific Endeavour was about transitioning from the single ship deployments that we were doing to Southeast Asia quite frequently, to be honest. Certainly every year there was at least 2 kind of 3-month deployments from my memory, to moving it to being a concentrated task group and a show of force. So by moving back to the regional presence deployments, which are now single ship deployments, yes, maybe there is more presence and that might be part of the case, but what you're not showing is that key demonstration of capability. And I would say that Indo-Pacific Endeavour was also increasingly designed to incorporate other countries in it. So I think 2 years ago we saw a detachment of, might have been Philippines Marines on one of the amphibs. You actually saw it chop in and out of other key exercises during that period. So it wasn't just Australian ships and Australian people. It was kind of growing, not on the same level as the UK carrier strike group that's coming out here in terms of international participation, but it was growing along that way. And so I just look, thank you to all the hard work of the people who are working on IPE 25 if you're watching this, but I really think it is a loss in terms of, if you think about Australia's wider strategy and one of the things that we're trying to demonstrate in terms of deterrence, I think this is a loss. Anyway, what else are we talking about? What else is happening?
So I'm going to briefly mention something that we talked about quite a lot, and that happened actually pretty soon after our last podcast, which was developments in the Red Sea and with the Houthis. It's not directly in the Indo-Pacific, but is something that's very relevant, and we talk about, as I say, quite regularly. On the 6th, so a little while ago now, President Trump ordered suddenly the end of the strikes that were taking place, the continuing strikes that were taking place against Houthi targets in Yemen. Now, the strikes had initially been sort of the messaging behind them was that this was the Americans effectively trying to stamp out the ability of the Houthis to attack shipping in the Red Sea. The decision to stop those strikes came as part of a deal that was mediated by the Omanis, in which case sort of is that the quid pro quo being that the Houthis agreed to stop attacking what is referenced as US shipping. Now, quite what is meant by US shipping, we don't really know. And in fact, that's kind of the point I'd make about this, is that there's a huge amount about which we don't really know. The Houthis very quickly made it clear that they viewed this as a success on their part, and that they would continue and have continued to attack Israel. After all, that was the original rationale behind the attacks in the Red Sea, was supposedly all of this was linked to Israeli operations in Gaza. There's also uncertainty about the role of Tehran so the Iranians in trying to basically pull back the Houthis from antagonizing the Americans any more than they necessarily have to. But I think it's interesting. I think there's been quite a lot of chat since then about the and reporting, particularly from the American side, about the limits and limitations of the American strikes and the American ability to degrade the Houthis' capability. And so I think that there's still some real questions, and for now at least, shipping seems to still be avoiding the Red Sea because of the uncertainty over it. But I think it's an interesting development, but it's very much a case of watch and see, and I don't think we yet really know quite what a lot of this means. What were your takes on this one?
Yeah, I thought it was a little bit curious. Clearly, it's coming at the same time that, and this is not a maritime issue, but everything bleeds into the maritime. At the same time, the US is having talks with Iran about Iran's nuclear program, and so clearly there is some, I would suspect, leaning on the Houthis to just retract a little bit while these talks are happening. Iran is very keen to have a number of the sanctions placed on Iran lifted because of the impact on their economy. I think the second element that really kind of plays into this as well is, and we're going well beyond maritime, so I'll just quickly mention it, I won't delve into it, but is the relationship between the US and Israel. I think it was significant that the US president went to the Middle East and didn't go to Israel or meet with the Israeli Prime Minister. I don't think the Houthis are done with attacking shipping whatsoever. Clearly there is about to be a surge of activity in the Israel conflict in Gaza, which we won't delve into, but I think we're going to see Houthis attacking shipping as well. I think that there is potentially some influence within the US administration where people have said, come on, we're wasting all of these weapons and we're not achieving anything. We need to focus on the Indo-Pacific. So I suspect all of those things are playing into this conversation, but I don't think we've seen the last of Houthis attacking shipping, and that's why you're not seeing shipping companies really going back through the Red Sea, because I think all of their intel organizations would be telling them that, and certainly the war risk insurance through that region has not reduced.
Oh, so yeah, it sounds like we're going to continue to talk about the Red Sea for some time to come.
Yeah, when are we going to get back to talking about whether Australia should send a ship to the Red Sea? They were our best podcasts. Anyway.
Do you want to talk briefly about the Mexican training vessel in New York?
I do. Look, firstly, I just want to offer my thoughts and condolences to the Mexican Navy on this a pretty horrific incident. So we did see the incident over the weekend. So I think it was Sunday the 18th of May, potentially Saturday the 17th of May because of the time zone difference, where we saw in Manhattan, well, Brooklyn, New York, I'm not an American, the Mexican sail training vessel, which I'm not going to even try and pronounce because I will butcher it. But it's a sail training vessel from the Mexican Navy. It's quite familiar to many in Australia. In fact, it was in Australia in 2024 and has undertaken a number of visits to Australia since kind of 1998. It's one of those cruises that at the end of the training pipeline, I think they're kind of naval college equivalent, Mexican Navy cadets actually embark on it. And it was going on a 255-day journey around the world. It was in New York. It pulled off the pier, sternboarding off the pier, clearly to get into the center of the bay, pivot, and then start heading out. Now, what's happened is it has sternboarded into the center of the bay. It has then accelerated in its sternboarding, and it's hit the Brooklyn Bridge. So this is what's called, I'm not a sail expert, but it is called a bark rigging. If you're a sail expert and I've said that wrong, then please send your offense to Richard, not me. But what that has is it has three large main masts. So it's got the foremast, the mainmast, and the mizzenmast. The topmast of the three of them hit the bridge. Unfortunately, they were being crewed along the yardarms by the cadets, which is common for sail training vessels when they sail from a port that everybody climbs up the mast. 2 cadets have died. There's a number severely injured, and there's a lot of conversation about what has happened here. What's actually happened, we don't know. You can go online. I'm sure we'll share a link. What's going on with shipping has a really good coverage of this. It's clear that there was some sort of failure on the vessel. The vessel comes out. It then seems to accelerate towards the Brooklyn Bridge. The New York police have put out a report that they said that the vessel came out, had an engineering failure, and the current carried them. Now, there is likely a fair bit of current going up that river, but not that fast. It looks like it's at about 5 knots by the time it hits the bridge. Some interesting elements, too, in terms of when it's come off the berth. They clearly had a pilot on board, a New York pilot who's an expert in that area as part of the US requirements. And interestingly, it had a tug in the vicinity, but the tug wasn't attached. And that's one of the things that's kind of directed a lot of attention. For a vessel that's not that maneuverable, that's coming out of a port that it's, off a pier that it's not that familiar with, it does seem a little bit odd not to have a tug attached until you've done your pivot and decided to start accelerating down the river. So look, a lot to kind of pull apart on that one. I think it's just worth kind of acknowledging that it has happened, and again, offering the sympathy and condolences to the Mexican Navy and the families of those that have passed away.
Yeah, definitely a sad one, and a pretty horrible footage that you can see if that's what you so desire. But yeah, not a pleasant one. Moving on, talking about capability. What's been going on in capability recently?
Well, there's been a lot of things happening in this region in terms of capability. We're still seeing a key trend of countries announcing new uncrewed surface vessels and uncrewed underwater vehicles. I don't think we really have time to go into it, but I note that the Royal Navy has launched their Excalibur, which looks a lot like the Australian Navy's Ghost Shark, obviously by a different company. We're also seeing kind of a number of ships and submarines getting delivered for more regional countries. And we know that there is part of a naval modernization going on in the region, not just in China and Australia. Many of the other coastal states are seeking to upgrade their navies. So Singapore recently announced that it was going to acquire 2 more Invincible class submarines to be built in Germany by TKMS. Now, Singapore's had quite an interesting journey with the acquisition of submarines. So it first started operating submarines in the early 2000s, and these were second-hand Swedish submarines. So it had the Challenger class, of which it still has 2 of, the Archer class. But then in 2021, it got its first of the Invincible class. Now, originally the order was for 4. 4 of those have been built in Germany. Singapore calls it the Type 218 SG, but it's based on the German TKMS Type 214 conventional submarine. Notably, this one has air-independent propulsion, which does make it quieter in certain circumstances. So this is significant in terms of an expansion of the Singaporean submarine fleet. I think it's also interesting how quickly TKMS have managed to build these submarines for Singapore. So look, again, it's just part of that kind of expansion of coastal navies generally. We don't necessarily know what this means for the older submarines that Singapore is operating. So that means there are currently 8 submarines in Singapore's orbit. The last 2 of those are still actually in Germany doing trials, but they'll be delivered this year. This means that Singapore will technically be operating 10 submarines. You would suspect to see that the Challenger-class submarines will be decommissioned fairly shortly afterwards. But I think Singapore's kind of transition to the Invincible-class submarines, well, certainly from an outsider's perspective, is quite a successful transition. And when we talk about the Singapore's Defence Force and Navy, I just like to highlight that Singapore is a country of 5.9 million people. And they have managed to sort out a lot of their acquisition and start to transform their naval capability in a way that other navies are struggling. So I think that's kind of an interesting development. Also, quickly, before I hand to you, Richard, just talk about another navy that is modernising and expanding its capability. So I just thought I'd touch on the Philippines Navy as well. So the Philippines Navy has been trying to modernise for a while. So actually in 1995, they released a Modernisation Act that was meant to be a 15-year plan to modernise. It really didn't happen. It wasn't resourced. It was held back by things like the global financial crisis, the impacts of terrorism within the Philippines. It wasn't really a focus. There've been a couple of other acts since, is my understanding, but really we've seen movement under the current administration in the Philippines in terms of that modernisation of the Navy. In the last couple of weeks, we've seen a new guided missile corvette, the Miguel Malvar, be delivered and commissioned within the Philippines. That one was built in South Korea by Hyundai. And what we have seen, I wouldn't necessarily say it's a rapid modernisation of the Philippines Navy, but we are seeing over the last couple of years that modernisation. I think it was in 2021 or maybe 2020, they finally decommissioned their last World War II ship that they were operating, that until that point had made up the bulk of the Navy. And so I think this is, a good story in terms of the number of the ships that the Philippines Navy is now commissioning, and how they are kind of transitioning from being a defence force that was focused really on internal challenges, on counter-terrorism, to becoming a more maritime-focused defence force. And that is part of their kind of territorial strategy that they talk about, which is seeing things like, their Marine Corps transition to acquire the BrahMos missile. So a new ship for the Philippines Navy. While we talk about this, though, I just do want to talk about some of the timings for frigates. So I'm going to talk about the Philippines Navy frigate. We'll talk about the Megami a little bit. I just want to highlight the timing between contract signing for a frigate in some of these countries and delivery of a frigate. As part of their naval modernisation, so the Philippines are getting 4 frigates built in South Korea. In 2016, they signed a contract with HHI to get 4 frigates. In 2018, steel was cut for the first frigate, which is the Jose Rizal, so within 2 years. Okay, so Australia signed its Hunter-class frigate contract in 2018. We started cutting steel in 2024, so that's 6 years in our most significant strategic circumstances since World War II, according to our strategy. And then having cut steel in 2018 for the Jose Rizal, the Jose Rizal was effectively delivered in, where are we at?
2020.
2020. So, contract signed in 2016 for the 4 frigates. 2018 cut steel. 2020, the Philippines Navy is operating a new frigate. And actually now they're operating 3 with a 4th to come. For Australia, 2009 white paper identified that we needed to replace the Anzac-class frigates. 2018, the contract was signed to do that. 2024, 6 years later, we've cut steel. And we expect the first to be delivered in 2032, which is 8 years. And I'm not saying that to be flippant, but I really think when we talk about the sense of urgency in shipbuilding, if you look at the Philippines and what they've done with South Korea, albeit different scale to what we're talking about, and you look at our timelines, you can see that there are some challenges for us. Anyway, speaking of shipbuilding, Japan has commissioned another Megami. Do you want to talk about that?
Yes, so, and I need to get my facts right with this, because I do find the Megami's confusing, potentially intentionally confusing. So the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force has commissioned the 7th Mogami. Now, I'm almost certainly going to butcher the pronunciation, but I would say it's the Nyodo. This is notable because she is the first of the Mogami class to be equipped with the Mark 41 VLS vertical launch system missile tubes. The previous 6 have been sort of designed for but not with, to use the phrase that's invariably used in the business. So there's a kind of a space for them, and the basic architecture is there to accommodate these missiles or these missile cells, but they are not installed. Now, this is the first one which is installed where these are installed from build. The Japanese have since said that they are going to retrofit the previous 6 with the VLS cell. This is a 16-cell VLS block in these, and these are the original Mogami class frigates. As I understand it, there will eventually be 12 of these of the original design. And then there will be an additional 10 of the new design, which is sometimes referred to as the upgraded Mogami, and that is the one that is being considered for C3000, the Australian general purpose frigate. So it's this is the one that is effectively the preceding design, and whether or not it is a completely new design or merely an upgrade depends on kind of which bit of the brochure you happen to read at which particular time and which audience that is being targeted at. But I think it's an important development, and you're seeing again kind of the success of Northeast Asian naval shipbuilding. They're managing to produce these very effectively, and by all accounts, they're very good ships. So I think the Philippines' story of South Korea as an export naval shipbuilder, and the Japanese primarily entirely focused on their own market up until this point. But again, another naval shipbuilding success story.
Yeah, and I just want to highlight kind of some of the timelines of this shipbuilding success story. And again, I just really think in Australia we're kind of, we fall into this lull of, okay, we've got plans for the future. We know we have an issue and we're addressing it in a timely fashion, right? But I think you can see from the comparison of the Philippines timelines and our Hunter timelines, it's not a timely fashion. And even if you compare it to the general purpose frigate, which we're saying that we're going to make a decision in 2025, we really identified in 2023 it needed to be addressed. Certainly the government are saying it's going to be addressed in 2025. And we might have one by 2029. So that's still 6 years between articulating the need in 2023, right? And 2029. So the Mogami class frigate for Japan. So in 2015, the Japanese defense budget allocated funds for the construction of a new compact type hull, which was going to become the Mogami. The first design was developed in 2015. In 2017, the prime was selected. In 2019, construction began, and in 2025, they have just commissioned their 7th. They've actually launched 10, but they've commissioned 7. So that is in a 10-year period. Now, 10 years on from Australia agreeing to acquire the Hunter-class frigate, we will have none in the water. I think I'm making my point about the urgency of shipbuilding. Now, it's not as straightforward. There are other considerations like building shipyards, creating supply. Like, it's not as straightforward as I've just explained it. But I think if we're talking about we are in our most significant strategic circumstances since World War II, and we have the least number of surface combatants since the 1950s, then these timelines are quite lengthy, is my point. I think the other point I want to highlight about the Mogami too, we often use the terms Mogami and upgraded Mogami quite interchangeably. And I think that's kind of been helpful in terms of maybe the tender process in Australia, I'm not sure. But they really are quite different vessels, really different vessels. In fact, so the displacement of a Mogami is 5,200 tonnes, which is bigger than an Australian Anzac class frigate. The upgraded Megami will be 6,200 tons, which is only 1,000 tons smaller than a Hobart-class destroyer. They're increasing the length of the hull, which is, that's a different design. So from 133 meters to 142 meters, 10 meters in length. They're increasing the beam by about 0.7 of a meter. It'll have 32 VLS cells, not the 16 that the Megami we've just spoken about. The 7th one that's been launched now has an enlarged radar mount, an improved hull, sonar suite, etc. going on. So they're really not the same ship, and I just want to just thought it's worthwhile highlighting that point. Anyway, Richard, we are going well over time today.
We are, and the only point I will make is, and I absolutely agree with most of what you're saying, and the push you're making about the speed of Australian shipbuilding. I do think that the interesting one from my perspective is primarily the the Philippines South Korean example, because I think the Japanese have a very well established industry. They have everything that they can build on, and they have a very good model of how that industry works, including things like they retire ships relatively young in order to maintain a continuous drumbeat of construction. The Philippines example obviously is very different, and there you can see the willingness of a much smaller navy, say, than the Royal Australian Navy, to basically take something that's pretty much off the shelf. And that gives you a lot of advantages in terms of speed. If you're willing to take systems that are broadly, they're operating South Korean weapon systems, and I'd have to double check on the sensor suites and things. But my understanding is that this is very much a case of them going to the South Koreans and asking them for a platform in a way that somewhere like the Royal Australian Navy doesn't do, in some ways for good reason. But that causes a lot of the precise issues that end up with the time delay or the delay around the decisions in the first place, and then the delay around the ability actually to execute that. Now, I think perhaps the question, and at least in part this is the whole discussion around C3000, is are the strategic circumstances such that we ought to throw those kind of questions out the window and get any capability as quickly as possible, or actually are we saying that we're not there yet? And I think that's the really difficult one, and certainly it's not a question that I can come up with a good answer to. But I think that the reality is that if we want to create a really good warship for a long time that doesn't have a whole host of problems with it in terms of different combat systems, different training, different accreditation, all of the other problems that come along with operating radically different warships, then it does just take longer. So,
are you? This might be our first controversial one since the Red Sea. Are you justifying the timelines for the Hunter class frigate?
I'm not justifying the timelines
because
for the Hunter
I'm not sure
frigate.
they're just. And I take your.
I am merely pointing out that the 4-year example between contract signing and delivery is perhaps something that is not necessarily achievable if you are looking for, if you're a navy of a size where you feel you can set your own requirements and you want to install a lot of your own kit. I'm thinking also, if you look at the challenges that, for example, the United States are having on their frigates, at the moment, which in many ways mirror quite a lot of the challenges that have been had in Australia. So I'm just suggesting that doing the classic academic thing of saying it's not quite that simple would be my one-line takeaway from this.
So I agree it's not quite that simple, but I do think that the timelines really aren't okay. I think it does generate strategic risk for Australia. And I think it's a question of where do you want to weigh your risk, right? Do you want to wear strategic risk? And right now we're saying we don't have 10 years warning time, yet we're still taking more than 10 years. I mean, the first Hunter-class frigate, which was agreed to before the Defence Strategic Update in 2020, will be delivered more than 10 years after the Defence Strategic Update. So there's a disconnect in our strategic statements, and our capability delivery. So what you can say about the capability delivery timeframes is we're willing to wear the risk in terms of not having the capability rather than wear the risk on interoperability with the remainder of the fleet or not having the best capability. But if you go back to what the Defence Strategic Review said about minimum viable capability, which is articulated also in the National Defence Strategy, it's saying that we should be wearing the risk on the capability side, not on the strategic side. So I just think that's a significant disconnect. And I think that, I know people are sick of talking about it, but we can't stress enough the risk of having 9 surface combatants in 2026. And that's not 9 surface combatants, because that's 9 surface combatants with a number that are going through significant upgrades, which means it's substantially less than 9 surface combatants. Like, I really think that is a significant risk. And
well, I think we've got a did you know? I saw you were very keen on marking a historic moment on social media recently.
So I just wanted to talk about the Captain Cook graving dock. Now, I would say the success of it, but history would say that's not entirely true, because it took us a long time to get to the point of 1940 when the government announced that the Captain Cook graving dock would go ahead. So the Captain Cook graving dock is in Garden Island in Sydney. When it was constructed, it was the largest graving dock, dry dock. On the 21st of May, we're recording this on Thursday, the 22nd of May. It was the 85th anniversary of the government making the decision to build the Captain Cook graving dock. It was opened in March 1945, so actually earlier this year. It was the 80th anniversary. It took just under 5 years to build it. It is pretty significant. Some of the scale, it's 347 metres long, it's 45 metres wide. It can pump out roughly, did you know, 259 million litres of seawater in about 4 hours. So that's pretty impressive. It is so the Commonwealth does own the Captain Cook graving dock at Garden Island, but day to day the operation and maintenance has been contracted out since 1999. Did used to be managed by the Department of Defence, and it does maintain naval assets, but it also does maintain civilian assets. And it is always very busy because it is the only dry dock in Australia that can handle most of these ships. It is big enough to take the Canberra-class landing helicopter dock, so the LHDs, and so it's a critical element for really fleet readiness. Now, I just wanted to highlight kind of the significance of it, the 85th anniversary of the government announcing it. It was part of a key strategic plan once the base in Singapore was lost during World War II. We won't really delve into that, but it really impacted the ability to maintain and repair warships, and the Captain Cook graving dock was kind of meant to address some of that. Now, since the 2024 structure plan, there has been a lot of discussion in Australia about maritime infrastructure in Western Australia to support naval capability. And the full structure plan in 2020 that came with the Defence Strategic Update talked about the need for a graving dock. Now, we are about to hit the 5-year anniversary since the Defence Strategic Update in 2020 and the Force Structure Plan in 2020, which is 5 years since we decided that we needed to build a a dry dock, graving dock in Western Australia. And 5 years later, we don't have one. In 1940, we decided we were going to build one, and 5 years later, we had the biggest one in the Southern Hemisphere. Now, it is acknowledged that we do need one. It certainly will need to come as part of the AUKUS pipeline. But I just wanted to say, did you know about the Captain Cook graving dock? It was the biggest one in the Southern Hemisphere when it was built. It was built in less than 5 years. Did you know that, Richard? I bet you did.
I did know that, actually, yes. And it's been a critical part of the ability to project power at sea from Australia ever since. It was a critical asset for the British Pacific Fleet in its operations against Japan towards the end of the Second World War, and has been both for Royal Navy and Royal Australian Navy ever since. So, yeah, really important facility. So often we focus on big flashy things that go bang. Actually, dry docks, whether they're floating dry docks or large sort of established graving docks, are hugely important. And it's a massive problem that we like talking about building infrastructure and have been for some time. but actually very little has been achieved since the discussion of the new dry dock in Western Australia. What was it now? Yeah, nearly 5 years ago. So yeah,
I think it was probably discussed before that, but it's certainly announced in the full structure plan. But I guess I thought it was a good Did You Know. It's a good historical Did You Know. I know you love your history, Richard, but
absolutely.
also kind of to highlight a point, which, going back to the point about shipbuilding as well, and it is more complicated than we articulate in maritime matters. It is much more complicated. And again, thank you to those who are listening who are actually doing that hard work. But I think that the overarching point that I make about the dry dock and about the frigate construction is the disconnect in the timelines from our strategic documentation and what we're doing. And I just kind of highlight that in points in our history and other countries are managing to do these things faster. And I think we really do need to address some of those timelines.
And on that note, I think we're going to have to call it a day on this episode. We've covered quite a lot of ground, and hopefully you've enjoyed it. And we'll be back again in the next couple of weeks, talking once again about why maritime matters in the Indo-Pacific. Cheers, Jen.
Thanks, Richard.